I'm Ashly Stanley, 28, and I've spent most of my life being dismissed as the family drama queen. Every symptom, every doctor's visit, every moment of genuine pain, my mother would roll her eyes and whisper to relatives that I was just seeking attention again. The migraines that left me bedridden, the chronic fatigue that made simple tasks impossible, the mysterious joint pain that doctors couldn't immediately explain. All of it was supposedly fabricated for sympathy. For years, I believed maybe she was right. Maybe I was weak, maybe I was imagining things, maybe I really was just desperate for her love and attention. That last month, when I collapsed at work and spent 3 days in intensive care, something changed. The stack of medical records I received 2 weeks later didn't just validate my pain, it exposed a truth about my family that would shatter everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and the price of being believed. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family's story, this one's for you. The family photo from last Christmas still sits on my mother's mantle, and if you didn't know better, you'd think it captured the perfect American family. There's my mother, Helen, beaming with pride as she stands behind Miranda, her golden child, who's practically glowing in her designer dress. My father, Robert, has his arm around Miranda's waist, his smile genuine and warm. And then there's me, tucked into the corner like an afterthought, my smile strained and my complexion pale from another bout of what my mother called Ashly's mysterious ailments. Growing up, I learned early that there were two versions of the Stanley family story. There was the public version, where my mother would gush about Miranda's straight A's, her athletic achievements, her full scholarship to Northwestern, and her subsequent career as a pediatric nurse. Then there was the private version, where I was the source of constant worry, embarrassment, and frustration. Miranda was everything I wasn't: healthy, effortlessly successful, and most importantly, easy. She never complained about headaches. That would leave me sobbing in my room. She never missed school because she was too exhausted to get out of bed. She never required those late-night trips to urgent care that my mother would grumble about for weeks afterward. I remember being 8 years old, watching Miranda receive yet another academic award while I sat in the audience with an ice pack pressed to my forehead. My mother leaned over and whispered, "Why can't you be more like your sister?" She never lets anything slow her down. The words stung more than the migraine, and I found myself wondering if there was something fundamentally wrong with me beyond whatever was making me sick. The comparisons became a constant soundtrack to my childhood. Miranda didn't need to see a doctor this much at your age. Miranda never missed this many school days. Miranda doesn't make such a fuss about every little ache and pain. Each comparison chipped away at my confidence, making me question whether my symptoms were real or if I was somehow manufacturing them for attention. I didn't even want. The worst part wasn't the favoritism. It was the way my mother would spin my health issues into moral failings. When I couldn't participate in family hikes because my joints ached, it became evidence of my laziness. When I needed to lie down during family gatherings, it was proof of my selfishness. When I asked to go home early from events because I felt awful, it was confirmation that I was a drama queen who couldn't handle normal life. But that Christmas photo tells a different story if you know how to look. Miranda's radiant smile is genuine. She's never doubted her place in the family hierarchy. My father's expression is complicated, a mix of love and concern that he's never been allowed to fully express. And my mother's triumphant pose speaks volumes about who she's proudest of. What the photo doesn't show is what happened 30 minutes after it was taken, when I excused myself to the bathroom and threw up from the worst migraine I'd had in months. Or how my mother rolled her eyes when I asked if we could leave early, or how Miranda, genuinely concerned, offered to drive me home, only to be told by her mother that I needed to toughen up and stop ruining family events. Looking at that photo now, I see a family that learned to accommodate one story while dismissing another. And I see a young woman who spent years believing she was the problem, never realizing that the real issue was a family that couldn't handle her truth. The elementary school nurse's notes, buried deep in my medical records, paint a picture I'd almost forgotten. Mrs. Patterson, bless her heart, documented every single visit I made to her office from second grade through fifth grade. The pages are filled with careful handwriting. Ashly complained of severe headache, appeared pale and nauseous. Student reports joint pain, particularly in wrists and knees. Requested to lie down due to extreme fatigue, fell asleep immediately. I was 8 when it started, though. Looking back, there might have been signs even earlier. It began with headaches that felt like someone was squeezing my skull in a vice. Not the normal childhood bumps and bruises that ice cream could fix, but pain that made me want to crawl under my desk and disappear. The school lights became unbearable. Every sound felt amplified, and the nausea would hit in waves that left me gagging over the tiny sink in Mrs. Patterson's office. The first time the school called my mother, I remember the hope in my chest. Finally, someone else saw that I wasn't making this up. But when Mom arrived to pick me up, her face was tight with embarrassment and frustration. She smiled at Mrs. Patterson, apologized for the inconvenience, and assured her that I was probably just tired from staying up too late. The drive home was silent, except for my mother's sighs. "Ashly, you can't keep doing this," she said as we pulled into our driveway. "Mrs. Patterson is going to think something's wrong with you." The irony wasn't lost on me. Even then something was wrong with me, but apparently that was the problem. By third grade, the pattern was established. I'd wake up feeling like I'd been hit by a truck, struggle through morning classes, and inevitably end up in the nurse's office by lunch. Mrs. Patterson would take my temperature, check my throat, and document my symptoms with the thoroughness of someone who genuinely cared. She'd call my mother, who would arrive with barely concealed annoyance, and take me home with lectures about learning to push through discomfort. The fatigue was perhaps worse than the headaches. I'd fall asleep during story time, struggle to keep my eyes open during recess, and beg to go to bed immediately after dinner. My mother would tell people I was a tired child, as if it were a personality trait rather than a symptom. She'd joke with other parents about how I could sleep anywhere, anytime, making it sound charming rather than concerning. The joint pain started around 4th grade. My wrists would ache so badly I couldn't hold a pencil properly, and my knees would throb during gym class. Mrs. Patterson would see me limping to her office and gently examine my joints, noting the slight swelling that my mother insisted was just growing pains. When other kids complained about growing pains, they got sympathy and extra attention. When I complained about mine, I got eye rolls and suggestions that I was being too sensitive. Mrs. Patterson tried to advocate for me in her quiet, professional way. She'd gently suggest to my mother that the frequency and severity of my symptoms might warrant a doctor's visit. She'd point out that most children didn't experience headaches this intense or fatigue this overwhelming. But my mother had perfected the art of dismissing concern while appearing reasonable. "Oh, Ashly's always been dramatic," she'd say with a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "She gets these little episodes, but she's fine. Kids today are just more sensitive than we were." Mrs. Patterson would nod politely, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. She was a mother herself, and she knew the difference between normal childhood complaints and something more serious. The notes show that. Mrs. Patterson never stopped trying. She documented everything, called when symptoms seemed severe, and even suggested that I see the school counselor to discuss coping strategies for stress. But my mother had made up her mind about what my symptoms meant, and no amount of professional concern was going to change that narrative. Reading those notes now, I'm struck by how thoroughly Mrs. Patterson believed me. She never questioned whether my pain was real or suggested that I was making it up. She simply documented what she observed and advocated for what she thought I needed. She was probably the first adult in my life who took my symptoms seriously, and I'm grateful beyond words that she left a paper trail of her concern. The high school medical excuse forms tell a story of missed opportunities and growing isolation. Stack after stack of yellow slips, each one requiring a parent signature, each one another mark against my character in my mother's eyes. By freshman year, I was missing an average of 2 days per month. By senior year, it was closer to 1 day per week. High school was supposed to be the time when I proved I could overcome whatever was wrong with me. Instead, it became the period when my symptoms intensified and my mother's patience wore completely. Then, the migraines came more frequently, lasting for days instead of hours. The joint pain spread from my wrists and knees to my shoulders and hips. The fatigue became so overwhelming that I'd fall asleep in class despite getting 10 hours of sleep. The night before, I missed homecoming my sophomore year because I was bedridden with what felt like the flu, except it lasted 2 weeks and no one else in my family got sick. I missed the winter formal junior year because my joints were so swollen I couldn't walk in heels. I missed graduation party senior year because I was too exhausted to pretend to be normal for an entire evening. Each absence required a phone call to the school, and I'd listen from my bed as my mother explained to the attendance office that I was under the weather again. Her tone grew more clipped with each call, and I could practically hear her eye rolls through the bedroom wall. After she hung up, she'd come to my room with an expression that mixed concern with frustration. "Ashly, you can't keep missing school like this," she'd say, standing in my doorway with her arms crossed. "People are going to start thinking something's seriously wrong with you." The implication was clear. There wasn't anything seriously wrong with me, but I was creating the appearance that there was. The worst part wasn't the missed events or the academic struggles. It was the way my absences became family lore. At dinner parties, my mother would regale guests with stories about my delicate constitution and how I inherited my grandmother's tendency toward nervous conditions. She'd laugh as she told them about having to pick me up from school again, turning my medical struggles into entertainment for her friends. "Ashly's always been high-strung," she'd say, as if anxiety were the root of all my physical symptoms. "She gets these episodes where she just can't function and we have to wait them out." The guests would nod sympathetically, probably thinking I was some sort of hypochondriac who needed better coping mechanisms. My father tried to be supportive in his quiet way, but he deferred to my mother on most parenting decisions. He'd bring me soup when I was sick and ask if I needed anything, but he never challenged my mother's narrative about my symptoms. I think he was genuinely concerned, but he'd learned over the years that questioning my mother's judgment about my health led to arguments he couldn't win. The school guidance counselor, Mrs. Rodriguez, called my parents' junior year to discuss my attendance record. I wasn't failing. I was a decent student when I could actually be in class, but she was concerned about my ability to graduate on time. I sat in her office while she gently suggested that my frequent absences might indicate an underlying issue that needed addressing. My mother's response was swift and defensive. "Ashly has always been prone to these little episodes," she said, her voice taking on the patient tone she used when she thought someone was being deliberately obtuse. "She's very sensitive to stress, and sometimes her body just shuts down when she's overwhelmed. We're working on helping her build better coping mechanisms." Mrs. Rodriguez pressed gently, suggesting that the frequency and severity of my symptoms might warrant medical evaluation. She pointed out that most teenagers didn't experience the level of physical distress I seemed to be dealing with. But my mother had perfected the art of deflecting professional concern while appearing cooperative. "Oh, we've seen doctors," she said with a dismissive wave. "They all say the same thing, that teenagers go through phases and should grow out of it. Kids today are just more sensitive than we were." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. She was trained to recognize when something didn't add up, and my situation clearly didn't make sense to her. The most painful memory from high school was being selected for the Academic Honor Society, but being unable to attend the induction ceremony because I was having one of my episodes. My mother was supposed to be proud. This was exactly the kind of achievement she valued, but instead, she seemed almost annoyed that my health issues were interfering with her opportunity to bask in parental glory. "Typical Ashly," she muttered as I lay on the couch with an ice pack on my head. Finally does something worth celebrating, and she's too sick to show up. It was the first time I realized that my mother saw my symptoms not as medical issues, but as personal failings that reflected poorly on her parenting. The emergency room discharge papers from my sophomore year at State University still make my chest tight when I read them. Patient presented with severe fatigue, joint pain, and altered mental status. Dehydration and malnutrition noted. Admitted for observation and for fluids. What they don't capture is the terror I felt lying on that gurney, or the way my mother's face hardened when she arrived to find me hooked up to monitors. College was supposed to be my fresh start, my chance to prove that I could function independently, despite whatever was wrong with me. I'd chosen a school 4 hours from home partly because I wanted space from my mother's constant scrutiny, and partly because I hoped that distance might somehow make me healthier. For the first semester, I almost convinced myself it was working, but by spring semester of my freshman year, the symptoms were getting worse. The migraines were coming twice a week instead of twice a month. The joint pain was so severe that I had trouble carrying my backpack across campus. The fatigue was so overwhelming that I'd fall asleep in the library. At my desk, even standing up waiting for the bus, I tried to manage it the way I'd learned at home by pushing through, by pretending everything was fine, by telling myself that everyone else dealt with being tired and stressed. I survived on energy drinks and ibuprofen, caught naps between classes, and convinced myself that this was just what college felt like for every finals week of sophomore year broke me. I'd been running on fumes for months, barely keeping up with coursework despite being genuinely interested in my psychology major. The night before my developmental psychology exam, I collapsed in my dorm room. My roommate, Sarah, found me unconscious on the floor and called 911. The paramedics were kind but efficient, asking questions I couldn't answer coherently. How long had I been feeling this way? Had I been eating regularly? When was the last time I'd had a full night's sleep? Sarah answered what she could, explaining that I'd been struggling for months, but insisted I was fine. The emergency room was a blur of tests and concerned faces. Blood work, x-rays, 4 fluids, and a parade of medical students who looked at my chart with confusion. A young resident, Dr. Martinez, sat beside my bed and asked questions no one had ever asked before. "How long have you been experiencing fatigue like this?" she asked, her voice gentle but professional. "Since I was little," I admitted, too exhausted to maintain the pretense that this was normal, "but it's gotten worse in college." She made notes, asked about my family history, and seemed genuinely concerned about my symptoms. For the first time in years, I felt like someone was taking my health seriously. She ordered more tests, kept me overnight for observation, and told me she wanted to refer me to a specialist. Then my mother arrived. I heard her voice in the hallway before I saw her, that particular tone she used when she was embarrassed and angry at the same time. She swept into my room like a storm, her face a mask of concern for the medical staff and fury for me. "Oh, Ashly," she said, rushing to my bedside in a performance of maternal worry. "What happened, honey? Are you okay?" But her eyes were cold, and her hand on my arm felt more like a warning than comfort. Dr. Martinez began explaining my condition: severe dehydration, malnutrition, signs of chronic fatigue that needed follow-up. My mother nodded along, playing the part of the concerned parent, but I could see the embarrassment in her posture. She's always been prone to these dramatic episodes, my mother said, her voice carrying that familiar dismissive tone. Ever since she was little, she's had this tendency to let stress overwhelm her. I've been telling her she needs to learn better coping mechanisms. Dr. Martinez looked confused. Mrs. Stanley, your daughter is showing signs of a chronic condition. This isn't about stress management. She needs medical evaluation. My mother's smile became strained. Oh, we've been down this road before. She's seen plenty of doctors, and they all say the same thing, that she's sensitive and needs to learn to push through discomfort. Kids today are just more fragile than we were. I watched Dr. Martinez's expression change as she realized she was dealing with more than just a medical case. She looked at me with something like pity, and I felt the familiar shame creep in. Even here in a hospital bed with proof of my condition, my mother was rewriting the narrative. The drive back to campus was silent except for my mother's periodic sighs. Finally, she spoke. Ashly, you can't keep doing this. You're in college now. You need to act like an adult. This dramatic behavior has to stop. I collapsed, Mom. I was unconscious. You were dehydrated and stressed. That's what happens when you don't take care of yourself properly. Her voice was sharp with frustration. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it was to get that call? To have to explain to people that my daughter is in the hospital because she can't handle college. I stared out the window, too tired to argue. The discharge papers in my bag felt like evidence of something important, but I could already feel my mother's version of events taking hold. By the time we reached my dorm, I was starting to wonder if she was right, if I really was just too weak to handle normal stress. That night, alone in my room, I read the discharge papers over and over. Dr. Martinez had written detailed notes about my symptoms, her concerns, and her recommendations for follow-up care. For a few hours in that hospital bed, I felt validated and heard. But my mother's reaction had already begun to erode that brief moment of medical confirmation. I never followed up with the specialist. Dr. Martinez recommended. My mother convinced me it was a waste of time and money, that I just needed to toughen up and develop better habits. But I kept those discharge papers tucked away in a folder with all the other medical documentation that proved my symptoms were real, even when everyone around me insisted they weren't. The work performance review from my first job sits in my files like a bittersweet reminder of what might have been. Ashly demonstrates exceptional analytical skills and creative problem-solving abilities. However, attendance issues remain. Concern. Frequent sick days impact team productivity and project continuity. My supervisor, Janet Morrison, had tried to be diplomatic, but the message was clear. I was talented but unreliable. Landing the position at Meridian, marketing straight out of college, felt like a miracle. Despite my spotty academic attendance record, my portfolio was strong, and I'd managed to impress them during the interview process. For the first time since childhood, I felt like I had the chance to prove that I was more than my health issues. The job was everything I dreamed of: creative, challenging, working with a team of brilliant people on campaigns for major clients. I threw myself into the work with desperate enthusiasm, staying late when I felt well enough, volunteering for extra projects, and trying to be the employee I knew I could be if my body would just cooperate. But my symptoms didn't respect my career ambitions. The migraines would hit without warning, turning my computer screen into a torture device and making concentration impossible. The joint pain made typing agony on bad days, and the fatigue was so overwhelming that I'd catch myself nodding off. During important meetings, Janet noticed the pattern within the first few months. She was a compassionate manager, the kind who genuinely cared about her team's well-being. But she also had a business to run. The first time she pulled me aside to discuss my absences, her concern was evident. "Ashly, is everything okay at home?" she asked, closing her office door for privacy. "I've noticed you've been out sick quite a bit. and I want to make sure you have the support you need." I felt the familiar knot of shame in my stomach. How could I explain that I wasn't dealing with a normal illness, that I had mysterious symptoms? No one could diagnose, and my own family thought I was making it up. Instead, I mumbled something about adjusting to the work schedule and promised to do better. Janet was patient at first. She worked with me to adjust my schedule, allowed me to work from home on days when I wasn't feeling well, and even suggested I see the company's occupational health nurse. But as months passed and the pattern continued, I could see the frustration creeping into her expressions. The breaking point came during the Henderson Electronics campaign, our biggest client, and my chance to prove myself. I'd been working on the creative strategy for weeks, and the presentation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. Monday night, I was hit with one of the worst migraines I'd ever experienced, complete with nausea and light sensitivity that made opening my eyes pure torture. I called in sick that morning, my voice barely a whisper as I explained to Janet, but I couldn't make it in. The silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. "Ashly, this is the Henderson presentation. The client is flying in from Chicago specifically for this meeting. I know, I'm so sorry. Can someone else present? I can walk them through my notes. That's not the point." Janet's voice was strained with the effort of remaining professional. "This is your project, your strategy. The client requested you specifically because of your previous work." I ended up dragging myself to the office, pumped full of prescription migraine medication that made me feel like I was underwater. I stumbled through the presentation, squinting at my notes through sunglasses I couldn't remove, and somehow managed to secure the client's approval. But the victory felt hollow when I saw the concern and disappointment in Janet's eyes. The performance review 3 months later was inevitable. Janet had documented everything: the missed deadlines due to sick days, the projects that had to be reassigned, the client meetings I couldn't attend. But she'd also noted my contributions, the campaigns that had exceeded expectations, the creative solutions that had won awards. "You're incredibly talented, Ashly," she said, sliding the review across her desk. "That talent alone isn't enough in this industry. Clients need to know they can count on you, and team members need to trust that you'll be there when they need you." I stared at the mixed review, feeling the weight of every absence, every missed opportunity, every time my body had betrayed my ambitions. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. I was being penalized for symptoms I couldn't control, labeled as unreliable when reliability was all I wanted. That evening, I called my mother to vent my frustrations, hoping for some maternal support or understanding. Instead, I got the familiar lecture about personal responsibility and pushing through discomfort. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she said, her voice sharp with frustration. "You can't use your health as an excuse in the real world, Ashly. You need to learn to manage your stress better and stop letting these episodes control your life. They're not episodes, Mom. They're medical symptoms that no doctor has ever been able to explain or treat effectively," she interrupted. "At some point, you have to take responsibility for your own well-being and stop expecting the world to accommodate your sensitivity." I hung up feeling more isolated than ever. At work, I was the unreliable employee with mysterious health issues. At home, I was the dramatic daughter who couldn't handle normal stress. The performance reviews sat on my kitchen table like evidence of my fundamental inadequacy, proof that no matter how hard I tried, my body would always undermine my success. But tucked in the folder with that review were dozens of client emails, praising my work, thank you notes from colleagues I'd helped, and evidence of campaigns that had exceeded all expectations. The disconnect between my capabilities and my reliability wasn't lost on me if I could just figure out what was wrong. With me, I knew I could be the employee I wanted to be. Miranda's wedding invitation arrived on cream-colored cardstock with gold-embossed lettering. the kind of elegant stationery that announced this was going to be a significant event. Miranda Stanley and David Chen request the pleasure of your company. The formal language couldn't hide what this really was, another milestone in my sister's charmed life. Another opportunity for my mother to beam with pride while I stood in the background, struggling just to stay upright. The engagement announcement 6 months earlier had set my mother into a frenzy of excited planning and social media posting. Miranda had met David during her pediatric nursing residency. He was a resident in emergency medicine, handsome, brilliant, and completely devoted to her. Their love story read like something from a romantic comedy. Brilliant medical professionals who fell in love while saving lives, planning a future filled with meaningful work and beautiful children. Can you believe it? My mother gushed during our weekly phone call, her voice practically vibrating with excitement. A doctor. Miranda's marrying a doctor. And he's from such a lovely family. His parents are both professors at the university. I made the appropriate congratulatory sounds while sitting in my darkened bedroom, nursing another migraine and wondering if I'd be able to attend the engagement party. The contrast wasn't lost on me. Miranda was building life with someone who understood her dedication to healing. While I could barely maintain a job because of my own health issues, the engagement party was everything. I'd expected elegant, well-attended, and completely centered around Miranda's perfection. She glowed in a way that had nothing to do with makeup, talking animatedly about wedding plans and her new position at Children's Hospital. David stood beside her, clearly besotted, introducing her to his colleagues as the most amazing woman I've ever met. I managed to attend for 2 hours before the combination of crowd noise, bright lights, and stress triggered one of my episodes. As I quietly gathered my purse to leave, my mother intercepted me near the door. "Where are you going?" she hissed, her smile frozen in place for the benefit of nearby guests. "I'm not feeling well. I think I should head home." Her expression tightened. "Ashly, this is your sister's engagement party. You cannot leave early because you're having one of your episodes." "I'm not having an episode, Mom. I have a migraine, and the noise is making it worse." "Then take some aspirin and find a quiet corner. You are not leaving and making a scene at Miranda's party." I spent the rest of the evening huddled in the bathroom, periodically emerging to smile and nod through conversations about wedding venues and honeymoon destinations. Meanwhile, Miranda effortlessly worked the room, looking beautiful and healthy, and everything a bride-to-be should be. The wedding planning process became a 6-month celebration of Miranda's perfection. Every detail was discussed and photographed, and shared on social media with captions about perfect love and dream weddings. My mother threw herself into the role of mother of the bride with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting her whole life for this moment. My role in the wedding was carefully managed to minimize the risk of any health-related disruptions. I was a bridesmaid, but not the maid of honor. That honor went to Miranda's college roommate, someone reliable who wouldn't risk missing rehearsals or looking pale in photos. My bridesmaid duties were limited to showing up and looking presentable, with backup plans in place in case I had one of my episodes. The dress fittings were particularly painful, both literally and emotionally. While the other bridesmaids chatted excitedly about the wedding and their own relationships, I stood silently as the seamstress took my measurements and noted how much weight I'd lost due to stress and poor appetite. "Are you feeling okay, honey?" the seamstress asked quietly, her experienced eye noting my pale complexion and the way I swayed slightly on my feet. "She's fine," my mother answered before I could respond. "Ashly's just been working too hard lately. She needs to take better care of herself." Miranda, to her credit, seemed genuinely concerned about my health, but she was caught between her own happiness and family loyalty. She'd ask if I was okay, offer to help with anything I needed, but she was also planning the most important day of her life and couldn't afford to focus on my problems. The bachelor and bachelorette parties were telling glimpses into our different worlds. Miranda's bachelorette weekend was a carefully orchestrated affair in Napa Valley wine tasting, spa treatments, and Instagram-worthy moments with her closest friends. I begged off, claiming work obligations, but really knowing that a weekend of wine and late nights would leave me bedridden for weeks instead. I spent that weekend alone, watching Miranda's social media posts and feeling the familiar isolation that came with being unable to participate in normal social activities. Friends all looked healthy and vibrant, celebrating someone they clearly adored. I wondered what it would feel like to have that kind of energy, that kind of effortless participation in life celebrations. The wedding day itself was beautiful. Miranda was a radiant bride. David was a devoted groom, and my mother was in her element as the proud mother of the bride. I managed to get through the ceremony and most of the reception before the combination of stress, noise, and exhaustion overwhelmed me. I slipped away during the dancing, finding refuge in the hotel room. My parents had booked out later that night. My mother found me there, still in my bridesmaid dress, but lying in the dark with an ice pack on my head. "This is exactly what I was worried about," she said, her voice sharp with frustration. "Your sister's wedding day, and you're hiding in a hotel room because you can't handle a normal celebration." I stayed for the important parts, Mom. I was there for the ceremony and dinner. You missed the father-daughter dance. You missed the cake cutting. You missed your sister's special moments because you're too delicate to handle what everyone else manages just fine. I didn't respond because what was the point? In my mother's narrative, my absence from Miranda's perfect day was evidence of my fundamental weakness, not a symptom of whatever was wrong with me. And maybe after years of being told I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too fragile, I was starting to believe it myself. The wedding photos tell the story my mother prefers Miranda beautiful and glowing, our family looking happy and complete. I'm in most of them, smiling despite the pain, playing my role as the supportive sister. What the photos don't show is how much it cost me to be there, or how many times I had to step away to cope with symptoms that no one wanted to acknowledge. The text messages from my mother during my worst health crisis read like a masterclass in emotional manipulation. "This is getting ridiculous, Ashly. You need to stop using your health as an excuse for everything. People are starting to talk." Each message arrived like a digital slap while I was lying in bed, barely able to lift my head, wondering if I was dying by age 26. My symptoms had escalated beyond anything I'd experienced before. The migraines weren't just frequent, they were constant. A low-level throb punctuated by episodes of blinding pain that left me vomiting and begging for unconsciousness. The joint pain had spread throughout my body, making simple tasks like opening jars or climbing stairs an exercise in endurance. The fatigue was so profound that I felt like I was moving through quicksand, every action requiring tremendous effort. But the worst part wasn't the physical symptoms, it was the increasing isolation as my mother's frustration boiled over into outright hostility. What had once been dismissive comments about my sensitivity became cutting remarks about my character, my work ethic, and my impact on the family's reputation. The crisis began on a Thursday in March. I'd been struggling through a particularly bad week, missing 2 days of work and barely functioning on the days I did show up. Janet at work was being patient, but I could see the strain in her expressions during our brief interactions. I was holding onto my job by a thread, and we both knew it. That Thursday evening, I collapsed in my apartment kitchen while trying to make dinner. Not the dramatic movie-style collapse, but the slow-motion slide to the floor that comes when your body simply stops cooperating. I lay there for 20 minutes, too weak to get up, too dizzy to stand, staring at the ceiling and wondering if this was my new normal. I called my mother because I was scared and alone and needed someone to tell me I was going to be okay. Instead, I got a lecture about personal responsibility. "Ashly, you can't keep calling me every time you feel a little under the weather," she said, her voice sharp with annoyance. "You're 26 years old. You need to learn to handle these things yourself." "I'm not under weather, Mom. Something's really wrong. I can barely stand up. Have you been eating properly? Getting enough sleep? Managing your stress? Because if you're not taking care of yourself, you can't expect your body to function normally." The conversation deteriorated from there. I tried to explain how severe the symptoms were, how they were interfering with every aspect of my life, how scared I was that something serious was happening. She responded with increasingly frustrated comments about my inability to push through discomfort like other people. The text messages started the next day when I called in sick to work again. "This is embarrassing, Ashly," Janet called to check on you, "and I had to make excuses for your behavior, AGA-INN. Then you can't keep expecting the world to revolve around your mysterious ailments. And finally, people are starting to wonder if you're just lazy." Each message felt like a betrayal. While I was lying in bed, too sick to eat, too weak to shower, struggling with symptoms that terrified me, my own mother was more concerned about her reputation than my health. The messages kept coming throughout the weekend, a steady stream of criticism and demands that I get it together. Monday brought a new low when my mother called to inform me that she'd been talking to my Aunt Carol about my situation. Aunt Carol, according to my mother, had some strong opinions about young people who used health problems as crutches and thought I needed tough love rather than sympathy. "She thinks you've been enabled too much," my mother said, her voice carrying the authority of someone delivering a professional diagnosis. "That you've learned to use these episodes to get attention and avoid responsibility." And honestly, Ashly, I'm starting to agree with her. The accusation hit like physical blow. After years of struggling with symptoms that no one could explain or treat, being told that I was manufacturing them for attention felt like the ultimate betrayal. But the worst part was the seed of doubt it planted. What if they were right? What if I really was just too weak to handle normal stress? The family dynamic shifted after that conversation. My father, who had always been quietly supportive, became more distant, clearly influenced by my mother's narrative. Miranda, caught between her loyalty to me and her desire to maintain family peace, began offering gentle suggestions about stress management and lifestyle changes. The breaking point came during Easter dinner at my parents' house. I'd been having a particularly bad week, and the 3-hour family gathering felt overwhelming. But I forced myself to attend because I knew the consequences of missing another family event. I made it through dinner, sitting quietly while conversation swirled around me, trying to ignore the pounding in my head and the ache in my joints. When I asked to lie down for a few minutes during dessert, the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. My mother's smile became strained. My father looked uncomfortable, and Miranda shot me a warning look that clearly said, "Don't make a scene." "Of course you're tired," my mother said, her voice carrying just enough volume for the extended family to hear. "You've been working so hard lately." The emphasis on working made it clear what she really thought about my recent absences from my job. I retreated to my childhood bedroom, but the thin walls meant I could hear every word of the conversation that followed. My mother's voice explaining to my aunts and uncles how challenging it was to have a daughter who struggled with stress. My father's awkward attempts to change the subject. Miranda's diplomatic suggestions that maybe I was going through a difficult phase. The text messages that night were brutal. "You completely ruined Easter dinner. Everyone could see how uncomfortable you made the family. This behavior has to stop. You're 26 years old, not 6. I'm not going to keep making excuses for you." Lying in my apartment that night, reading those messages while dealing with symptoms that felt increasingly severe, I reached a point of complete despair. My family didn't believe me, my job was in jeopardy, and I was starting to doubt my own experiences. The isolation was complete. Even my own mother saw me as a burden rather than someone who needed help. But buried in that despair was a growing determination. If my family wouldn't take my symptoms seriously, I'd have to find someone who would. If my mother was more concerned about appearances than my health, I'd have to advocate for myself. The text messages that were meant to shame me into silence instead became evidence of something I was only beginning to understand, that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you most are the least capable of seeing your truth. Dr. Harrison's referral letter to the rheumatology department reads like a detective story with missing pieces. Patient presents with chronic fatigue, widespread joint pain, and recurrent headaches. Symptoms present since childhood, but have worsened significantly in recent years. Standard blood work shows some inflammation markers, but nothing definitive. Recommend specialist evaluation for possible autoimmune condition. Finally, at 27, I was taking control of my own medical care. After years of letting my mother dismiss my symptoms and discourage doctor visits, I'd made the decision to see a physician on my own. Dr. Harrison was an internal medicine specialist who came highly recommended. And for the first time in my adult life, I walked into a doctor's office without my mother's voice in my head telling me I was wasting everyone's time. The appointment was a revelation. Dr. Harrison really listened as I described my symptoms. He took detailed notes, asked follow-up questions, and never once suggested that my problems were stress-related or psychosomatic. When I mentioned that I'd been dealing with these issues since childhood, he frowned and asked why no one had investigated further. These symptoms, especially in combination and over this duration, suggest something systemic, he said, reviewing my hastily assembled medical history. Has anyone ever tested you for autoimmune conditions? I explained the years of being told I was sensitive, the dismissive comments about stress and anxiety, the way my family treated my symptoms as character flaws rather than medical issues. Dr. Harrison's expression grew more concerned as I talked. I want to run some comprehensive blood work, he said. And I think you should see a rheumatologist. Dr. Sarah Chen at the University Medical Center specializes in cases like yours, young women with complex symptom patterns that haven't been properly investigated. The blood work showed what Dr. Harrison called some interesting findings: elevated inflammatory markers, unusual antibody patterns, and signs that my immune system was overactive. Nothing definitive, but enough to justify further investigation. For the first time in my life, I had objective evidence that something was wrong with my body. When I called my mother to tell her about the appointment and the referral, her response was predictably dismissive. "Oh, Ashly, you're not seriously going down this road again, are you? How many doctors do you need to see before you accept that there's nothing wrong with you?" "Mom, Dr. Harrison found abnormalities in my blood work. He thinks I might have an autoimmune condition." Doctors love to find problems that don't exist, especially with young women who come in complaining about vague symptoms. You're giving him exactly what he wants to hear. But I was done letting her doubt override medical opinion. I made the appointment with Dr. Chen, and for the first time, I was determined to be completely honest about my symptoms without downplaying them to avoid appearing dramatic. The rheumatology appointment was both exhausting and validating. Dr. Chen spent 2 hours with me, conducting the most thorough physical examination I'd ever experienced. She tested my joints for swelling and tenderness, checked my reflexes, examined my skin for rashes I hadn't even noticed, and asked questions that no one had ever asked before. "Tell me about your mornings," she said, making notes as she spoke. "How do you feel when you first wake up?" "Terrible," I admitted, "like I've been hit by a truck. It takes me at least an hour to feel even close to human." She nodded like this was significant information. And the joint pain, is it worsen? Certain weather? Does it move around your body or stay in the same places? For the first time, someone was treating my symptoms like pieces of a puzzle rather than evidence of personal weakness. Dr. Chung ordered more specialized blood tests, x-rays of my joints, and something called a sleep study to check for disorders that might be contributing to my fatigue. The process took weeks, and during that time, my mother's criticism intensified. She seemed personally offended by my decision to pursue medical evaluation, as if my quest for answers was a direct attack on her years of dismissing my symptoms. "You're obsessing over this, Ashly," she said during one particularly tense phone conversation. "You're turning yourself into a professional patient instead of learning to cope with normal stress like everyone else." What if it's not normal stress? Mom, what if there's actually something wrong that could be treated? Then why hasn't any doctor found it before? You've seen plenty of doctors over the years, and they've all said the same thing, that you're sensitive and need to learn better. Coping mechanisms, that wasn't true. And I was finally beginning to understand how much my mother's presence at those childhood appointments had influenced the doctor's conclusions. When a parent consistently describes their child as dramatic and prone to exaggeration, medical professionals often take that information at face value. The most telling moment came when Dr. Chen called to discuss some of the test results. She'd found several abnormal markers that suggested immune system dysfunction, and she wanted to run additional tests to narrow down the specific condition. When I shared this news with my family, the reactions were revealing. My father seemed genuinely concerned and asked thoughtful questions about what the tests might show. Miranda, true to her medical training, was interested in the technical details and supportive of thorough investigation. But my mother's response was pure frustration. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "You've convinced this doctor that there's something wrong with you, and now she's going to find problems that don't exist." This is exactly what I was afraid would happen. What if she finds something real, Mom? What if there's actually been something wrong all these years? The silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. The possibility that I'd been suffering from a real medical condition, and that she'd spent years dismissing that suffering, was something my mother couldn't allow herself to consider. Dr. Chen's referral letter captured the complexity of my case in medical language, but it couldn't capture the emotional complexity of finally being believed. For the first time in my life, a medical professional was taking my symptoms seriously, investigating them thoroughly, and treating me like an intelligent adult rather than a dramatic child. The letter ended with a note that would prove prophetic. Patient symptom complex suggests possible systemic autoimmune condition. Previous dismissal of symptoms appears to have delayed diagnosis. Recommend urgent specialist evaluation. Reading those words, previous dismissal of symptoms appears to have delayed diagnosis, I felt a mixture of vindication and rage. A medical professional was acknowledging what I'd known for years, that my symptoms had been real, significant, and wrongly dismissed. The question now was whether the years of delay had caused permanent damage, and whether my family would be able to accept the truth about what I'd been going through. The ambulance report from that Tuesday morning is clinical and precise. Found patient unconscious on office floor. Co-workers report subject had been complaining of headache and fatigue, but remained at work. Vital signs stable, but patient disoriented and unable to respond to commands. Transport to St. Mary's Emergency Department for evaluation. What the report doesn't capture is the terror in Sarah from accounting's voice when she called 911, or the way my entire team gathered around my desk in stunned silence as the paramedics worked. It doesn't mention how Janet, my supervisor, rode in the ambulance with me, holding my hand and whispering reassurances I couldn't hear. And it certainly doesn't capture the way my mother's first words when she arrived at the hospital were about how embarrassing this was for the family. That morning had started like so many others, with me lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to summon the energy to get up and face another day. The migraine had been building for 3 days, a low-level throb that made concentration difficult and turned normal office lights into instruments of torture. The joint pain was particularly bad, making it difficult to type or even hold a coffee. Kept steady, but I'd been out sick twice the previous week, and I could feel Janet's patience wearing thin. The Henderson account was reaching a critical phase, and I had presentations to prepare, client calls to make, and deadlines that couldn't wait for my body to cooperate. So I did what I'd learned to do since childhood. I pushed through. The morning passed in a blur of forced productivity. I squinted at my computer screen through sunglasses, popped ibuprofen like candy, and tried to ignore the way my hands shook. As I typed, my coworkers noticed something was wrong. Sarah asked twice if I was feeling okay, and Tom from the creative department suggested I go home. But I insisted I was fine, just tired. Nothing a strong cup of coffee couldn't fix that by lunch. I was barely holding on. The migraine had evolved into something beyond pain, a crushing pressure that made me nauseous and disoriented. My vision was starting to blur at the edges, and I found myself having to read emails multiple times to understand their content. But the afternoon client call couldn't be rescheduled, and I was the only one who knew the account details well enough to handle it. The last thing I remember clearly is sitting in the conference room, staring at my notes and realizing I couldn't read my own handwriting. The words seemed to swim on the page, and when I tried to focus, the room started spinning. I excused myself to get some water and made it about 10 feet before everything went black. I woke up in the ambulance with the paramedic asking me questions I couldn't answer. What year was it? Where was I? What was my name? The questions seemed simple, but my brain felt wrapped in cotton, and forming words required tremendous effort. Janet was there, her face creased with worry, explaining to the paramedic that I'd been complaining of headaches but had insisted on working. The emergency room was a blur of bright lights and concerned faces. They ran the standard battery of tests, a T-scan, blood work, neurological exams, while I drifted in and out of consciousness. The attending physician, Dr. Roberts, seemed genuinely concerned about the severity of my symptoms and the fact that I'd lost consciousness. Has she been under any unusual stress? He asked Janet, who had appointed herself my emergency contact when they couldn't reach my family. She's been struggling with health issues for a while, Janet explained. Frequent headaches, fatigue, missing work. We've been trying to support her, but this is definitely the worst episode we've seen. Dr. Roberts made notes and ordered more tests. For several hours, I felt like my symptoms were being taken seriously, investigated thoroughly, treated as a legitimate medical emergency. The nurses were kind, the doctors were thorough, and everyone seemed to understand that something significant had happened. Then my mother arrived. I heard her voice before I saw her. That familiar tone she used when she was managing a crisis she found personally inconvenient. She swept into my curtained area like a storm, her face set in an expression of barely controlled frustration. "Oh, Ashly," she said, rushing to my bedside in a performance of maternal concern. "What happened? Are you okay?" But even through the fog of medication and exhaustion, I could see the anger in her eyes. This wasn't concern, this was embarrassment and frustration that I'd created another public spectacle. Dr. Roberts began explaining my condition to my mother, describing the loss of consciousness, the neurological symptoms, and his concerns about what might be causing such severe episodes. My mother nodded along, playing the part of the worried parent, but I could feel the tension radiating from her body. "Has she been under any stress lately?" Dr. Roberts asked. "Starting a new job, relationship problems, financial pressures." "Oh, she's always been prone to these dramatic episodes," my mother said, her voice carrying that familiar dismissive tone. "Ever since she was little, she's had this tendency to let stress overwhelm her system. I've been telling her she needs to learn better coping mechanisms. I watched Dr. Roberts' expression change as he processed this information. The concerned physician who had been investigating my symptoms suddenly became more skeptical, making notes about stress-related episodes and anxiety-induced symptoms. "Mrs. Stanley," he said carefully, "your daughter lost consciousness at work. This seems to be more than just stress." My mother's smile became strained. "Doctor, we've been dealing with these episodes for years." She's seen plenty of specialists, and they all say the same thing, that she's sensitive to stress and needs to learn to manage it better. "I think work has just been overwhelming for her lately." The remainder of my hospital stay was colored by my mother's narrative. What had started as a serious medical investigation became a discussion about stress management and anxiety disorders. Dr. Roberts still seemed concerned, but I could see him backing away from more intensive testing in favor of recommending therapy and lifestyle changes. The discharge paperwork reflected this shift. Patient experienced syncopal episode likely related to stress and dehydration. Recommend follow-up with primary care physician for stress management and possible anxiety evaluation. The ride home was silent except for my mother's periodic sighs. Finally, as we pulled into my apartment complex, she spoke. "Ashly, this has to stop. Collapsing at work, paramedics, hospital visits. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? What are people going to think?" "I didn't choose to collapse, Mom. Something's wrong, and it's getting worse." "What's wrong is that you can't handle normal stress like other people. You're 28 years old, and you're acting like a child who needs constant attention." That night, alone in my apartment, I read the ambulance report and discharge papers over and over. The medical evidence was clear. I'd lost consciousness, had abnormal neurological symptoms, and required emergency treatment. But somehow, by the time my mother finished helping the doctors understand my history, the narrative had shifted to stress and anxiety. The ambulance report would eventually become crucial evidence, proof that my symptoms were severe enough to require emergency intervention. But in that moment, it felt like just another piece of documentation that no one would believe mattered. The ICU admission forms paint a stark picture that even my mother couldn't reframe. Patient admitted with altered mental status, severe dehydration and signs of systemic inflammatory response, neurological status fluctuating, requires continuous monitoring and forced support. Family history notable for dismissal of chronic symptoms. That last line, added by Dr. Martinez from the emergency department, would prove to be the most important sentence in my entire medical file. Someone had finally documented what I'd been trying to explain for years, that my symptoms had been systematically dismissed by people who should have been advocating for my care. The collapse at work had been just the beginning. By the time the ambulance reached St. Mary's, I was drifting in and out of consciousness, unable to answer basic questions, my body temperature dangerously low. The emergency team moved with practiced efficiency, starting 4 lines, drawing blood, and ordering immediate imaging studies. Dr. Martinez took one look at my presentation and made the decision that probably saved my life. She admitted me to the intensive care unit for close monitoring. "I don't know what's causing this," she told Janet, who had followed the ambulance to the hospital, "but this young woman is seriously ill." The next 3 days exist in my memory as fragments: bright lights, concerned voices, the steady beep of monitors, and the strange floating sensation that comes with serious illness. I was aware enough to know that teams of doctors were consulting on my case, that tests were being run around the clock, and that the nurses spoke to me with the gentle urgency reserved for patients whose conditions are genuinely concerning. What I wasn't aware of until much later was the drama playing out in the waiting room. Janet had called my parents immediately, but it took my mother 6 hours to arrive at the hospital. 6 hours during which my supervisor, this woman who had known me for less than 2 years, sat in the ICU waiting room, answering questions about my health history and advocating for aggressive treatment. She's been struggling with symptoms for months, Janet told Dr. Martinez during one of her updates. Headaches, fatigue, joint pain, frequent absences. We tried to be accommodating, but it's been getting progressively worse. Has she seen any specialists? Been evaluated for autoimmune conditions? I suggested it several times, but she always said her family thought it was stress-related. Her mother seemed to think she was just sensitive to work pressure. When my mother finally arrived, the contrast between her reaction and Janet's was stark. Janet was genuinely frightened, asking detailed questions about my prognosis and treatment plan. My mother was managing a crisis she found personally inconvenient. "Oh, this is just Ashly being dramatic," I later learned she told the nursing staff. "She's always had these episodes where she can't cope with stress. I'm sure she'll be fine when she gets some rest." But the ICU staff had seen my test results. They knew that whatever was happening to me wasn't stress or drama. It was a serious medical condition that had been allowed to progress unchecked for too long. Dr. Chen. The rheumatologist I'd been scheduled to see the following week was called in for an emergency consultation. She arrived on my second day in the ICU, reviewed my test results, and immediately ordered additional specialized blood work. "This presentation is classic for severe autoimmune flare," she explained to the ICU team during rounds. "The inflammatory markers are off the charts, and the neurological involvement suggests this has been progressing for months, possibly years." By my third day in the ICU, I was conscious enough to participate in conversations, though I still felt like I was thinking through fog. Dr. Chan sat beside my bed and asked questions that no one had ever asked before. "Ashly, I need you to think back. When did these symptoms first start? Not when they got bad, but when you first remember feeling different from other kids." I told her about the elementary school nurse's office, the missed activities in high school, the college emergency room visit that my mother had dismissed. With each piece of history, Dr. Chen's expression grew more serious. "Has anyone ever suggested that your symptoms might be related to an autoimmune condition? My family always said it was stress, but I was too sensitive, too dramatic. That other people managed to push through discomfort, and I needed to learn how to do the same." Dr. Chen made notes, her jaw tight with what I would later recognize as professional anger. "Ashly, based on what I'm seeing in your blood work and your symptom history, I believe you have a serious autoimmune condition that has been progressing untreated for years. This wasn't stress, and it wasn't sensitivity. This was a real medical condition that should have been diagnosed and treated long ago." The words hit me like a physical blow. After years of being told I was imagining things, exaggerating symptoms, seeking attention, a medical professional was confirming that I'd been right all along. The relief was overwhelming, but it was mixed with rage at all the years of suffering that could have been prevented. On my fourth day, when I was stable enough to be moved to a regular room, my mother finally had the conversation with Dr. Chen. That would change everything. I wasn't present for it, but Janet later told me she could hear raised voices from the family conference room. "Mrs. Stanley," Dr. Chen had said, "according to Janet, who overheard through the thin walls, your daughter has a serious autoimmune condition. Her symptoms have been real, significant, and progressive. The delay in diagnosis has likely caused permanent damage that could have been prevented." My mother's response was predictably defensive. "That's impossible. We've seen doctors." They all said, "I've reviewed every piece of medical documentation in your daughter's file." Dr. Chen interrupted. "What I see is a pattern of symptoms being dismissed and a young woman being labeled as dramatic rather than properly evaluated. This is a failure of the medical system, but it's also a failure of advocacy." The silence that followed was telling. For the first time in my life, my mother was confronted by a medical professional who had all the facts. who had seen the test results and who wasn't willing to accept the narrative that I was just too sensitive to handle normal stress. When my mother visited me that evening, her demeanor was different. She sat quietly beside my bed, not meeting my eyes, her usual confident certainty replaced by something that looked almost like fear. "The doctor says you're very sick," she said finally, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "I've been trying to tell you that for years, Mom." She nodded slowly, but I could see her struggling to reconcile this new information with the story she'd been telling herself about my character and my symptoms. The IQ admission forms would become the turning point in our family's understanding of my health. The moment when the medical evidence became too overwhelming to dismiss or reframe. But even then, sitting in that hospital room with proof of my condition literally flowing through the fore in my arm, I could see my mother calculating how to manage this new reality without admitting how wrong she'd been for so many years. The official medical diagnosis sits in my file like a vindication written in medical terminology: systemic lupus erythematosus with neurological involvement and secondary fibromyalgia. Onset likely in childhood with progressive symptoms over 20 years. Delayed diagnosis has resulted in irreversible organ involvement. Dr. Chun delivered the news on a Thursday morning, 6 days after my ICU admission. I was finally alert enough to understand complex medical information, though I still felt like I was viewing the world through a haze of medication and exhaustion. She sat beside my hospital bed with a thick folder of test results, her expression serious but kind. "Ashly, we have answers," she began, opening the folder to reveal pages of lab reports highlighted in yellow and pink. "You have systemic lupus erythematosus, LE. It's an autoimmune condition where your immune system attacks your own tissues, causing widespread inflammation and damage." The words hung in the air like a foreign language I was just learning to understand. Lupus. I'd heard the word before, knew it was serious, but I never connected it to my symptoms. In my mind, lupus was something that happened to other people, people who looked sick, people whose illness was obvious and undeniable. The blood work shows multiple antibodies that are classic for lupus. Dr. Chun continued, pointing to specific numbers on the lab reports. "Your NA is strongly positive, your anti-dsDNA is elevated, and your complement levels are dangerously low. This isn't a mild case. This is aggressive, systemic disease that has been active for years." She explained how lupus could cause every symptom I'd experience: the migraines from inflammation affecting my central nervous system, the joint pain from arthritis, the crushing fatigue from my body's constant battle against itself. The pieces of my medical puzzle were finally falling into place, creating a picture that made devastating sense. "Based on your symptom history and the pattern of progression, I believe you've had lupus since childhood," Dr. Chun said gently. "The episodes you described, the headaches in elementary school, the fatigue in high school, the joint pain in college, those were all lupus flares. Without treatment, the disease has continued to progress and cause permanent damage." The revelation was simultaneously validating and heartbreaking. Every symptom I'd been told was imaginary, every episode dismissed as attention-seeking, every moment of pain labeled as drama. All of it had been real, measurable, and treatable if anyone had bothered to look. "Could this have been diagnosed earlier?" I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. Dr. Chun's expression darkened. "Absolutely. Lupus in young women often presents exactly as your symptoms did. The combination of fatigue, joint pain, and neurological symptoms should have triggered autoimmune testing years ago. With early diagnosis and treatment, much of the organ damage you've experienced could have been prevented." The weight of those words settled over me like a heavy blanket. Not only had I been suffering needlessly for years, but my body had been sustaining permanent damage that proper medical care could have prevented. The delay in diagnosis hadn't just cost me quality of life, it had cost me pieces of my future health. When my parents arrived that afternoon for the family meeting Dr. Chun had requested, the atmosphere in the room was tense with unspoken accusations. My mother sat rigidly in the visitor's chair, her face carefully neutral. My father looked concerned but confused, clearly struggling to process this new information. Dr. Chun didn't waste time with pleasantries. She spread the test results across the rolling bed table like evidence in a trial, each lab report highlighting the severity of my condition. Mr. and Mrs. Stanley, your daughter has severe systemic lupus erythematosus. This is a serious autoimmune disease that has been active and untreated for approximately 20 years. The delay in diagnosis has resulted in kidney involvement, neurological damage, and joint destruction that will require lifelong management. My mother's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. But the doctors we saw said it was stress, that she was sensitive. Which doctors? Dr. Chun interrupted, her professional demeanor barely concealing her anger. Because I've reviewed every piece of medical documentation in Ashly's file, and I don't see evidence of proper autoimmune testing or a specialist consultation. I see a pattern of symptoms being dismissed without investigation. The silence that followed was deafening. My father stared at the lab reports as if they were written in a foreign language. My mother's carefully maintained composure began to crack around the edges. Dr. Chun, my father said finally, we had no idea. If we had known the information was there, Dr. Chun said firmly but not unkindly. The symptoms were classic. The progression was textbook, and the family history your daughter provided shows a clear pattern of being dismissed rather than evaluated. This represents a significant failure of medical advocacy. I watched my mother process this information, saw the moment when the full implications hit her. For 20 years, she had convinced herself and everyone around her that I was weak, dramatic, attention-seeking. Now, a medical professional was telling her that I had been suffering from a serious disease, while she dismissed my pain as character flaws. What does this mean for her future? My father asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. Dr. Chun's expression softened slightly. With proper treatment, we can control the disease and prevent further damage. But the kidney involvement means she needs specialized care for life. The neurological damage is likely permanent, and the delayed diagnosis has complicated her prognosis significantly. She outlined the treatment plan: immunosuppressive medications, regular monitoring, lifestyle modifications, and a team of specialists to manage different aspects of the disease. It was overwhelming and expensive and would require the kind of medical advocacy I'd never received from my family. After Dr. Chun left, the three of us sat in silence. I stared at the diagnosis paperwork, still processing the magnitude of finally having answers. My father seemed lost in thought occasionally, shaking his head as if trying to reorganize 20 years of family history, and my mother sat frozen, staring at her hands. "Mom," I said finally, "do you understand what this means?" She looked up, and for the first time in my memory, I saw genuine uncertainty in her eyes. "It means you were right," she said quietly. "It means I was wrong." The admission was small and insufficient, but it was the first time she had ever acknowledged that my symptoms were real, that my suffering had been legitimate, that her dismissal had been harmful. It wasn't an apology that would come later, reluctantly and incompletely, but it was a crack in the narrative that had defined our family for decades. The official diagnosis would change everything: my treatment, my prognosis, my relationship with my family, and most importantly, my understanding of my own experience. For the first time in my life, I had medical validation that my pain was real, my symptoms were serious, and my years of advocacy for my own health had been justified. But holding that diagnosis paperwork, I felt a complex mix of emotions: relief at finally having answers, anger at the years of unnecessary suffering, grief for the healthy life I might have had with early diagnosis and treatment, and underneath it all, a growing determination to ensure that no one else would ever dismiss my medical reality again. The complete medical file from St. Mary's Hospital arrived 2 weeks after my discharge. 347 pages of documentation spanning 20 years, each page a piece of evidence in the case I'd been trying to make my entire life. The cover letter from Medical Records was brief. Per your request, please find enclosed all available medical documentation. Records include emergency department visits, specialist consultations, and test results from 2004 to 2024. I spread the papers across my dining room table like a detective organizing clues, and the pattern that emerged was both vindicating and heartbreaking. Starting with Mrs. Patterson's elementary school, nurse notes from 2004, and ending with Dr. Chun's lupus diagnosis in 2024. The progression was unmistakable: 20 years of documented symptoms, medical visits, and increasingly serious episodes that told the story of an undiagnosed autoimmune disease. The earliest entries were the most painful to read. Mrs. Patterson's careful documentation from ages 8 through 11 showed a clear pattern. Student reports severe headache, appears pale and lethargic. Ashly complained of joint pain in wrists and knees, slight swelling noted. Frequent visits for fatigue and nausea, symptoms seemed genuine and concerning. What struck me most was Mrs. Patterson's consistency. Month after month, year after year, she documented my symptoms with the thoroughness of someone who believed what she was seeing. Her notes included observations about my appearance, my behavior, and her communications with my mother. Reading between the lines, I could see her growing frustration with my family's dismissive attitude. One entry from 4th grade was particularly telling. Spoke with Mrs. Stanley regarding Ashly's frequent complaints of joint pain. Mother insists this is growing pains and that Ashly is overly sensitive. Recommend pediatric evaluation for possible underlying condition. Mother declined, stating Ashly needs to toughen up. The middle school and high school records showed the escalation. Attendance records documented increasing absences, while guidance counselor notes expressed concern about my ability to participate in normal teenage activities. Mrs. Rodriguez, my high school counselor, had made several attempts to advocate for medical evaluation, all blocked by my mother's insistence that I was simply stress sensitive. The college records were fragmentary but significant. The emergency room visit during my sophomore year was documented with impressive detail by Dr. Martinez, who had noted chronic fatigue, malnutrition, possible underlying autoimmune condition requires investigation. Her recommendations for specialist follow-up were clearly stated, and her notes included: patient reports family dismisses symptoms as attention-seeking behavior. Recommend independent medical evaluation. But it was the recent records that told the most complete story. Dr. Harrison's internal medicine evaluation included a detailed review of my symptom history and his growing suspicion of autoimmune disease. His notes were meticulous. Patient presents with 20-year history of symptoms consistent with systemic autoimmune condition. Previous medical care appears to have been influenced by family minimization of symptoms. Recommend urgent rheumatology consultation. Dr. Chun's records were a masterclass in thorough investigation. Her initial consultation notes documented not just my current symptoms, but her systematic review of every piece of medical evidence in my file. She had connected dots that previous doctors had never been allowed to see, creating a comprehensive picture of disease progression that spanned 2 decades. Most importantly, Dr. Chun had documented the pattern of dismissal itself. Her notes included phrases like family history of medical gaslighting, symptoms consistently minimized by caregivers, and delayed diagnosis due to systematic dismissal of patient complaints. She had made my family's role in delaying my Diagnosis, an official part of my medical record. The laboratory results told their own story. Blood work from my recent hospitalization showed inflammatory markers that were, in Dr. Chun's words, consistent with years of untreated autoimmune activity. But scattered throughout the earlier records were hints that previous doctors had missed slightly elevated SED rates, borderline abnormal cell counts, inflammatory markers that were dismissed as normal variants rather than investigated further. Particularly damning piece of evidence was a lab report from my college emergency room visit. Dr. Martinez had ordered an ANA test, a basic screening for autoimmune conditions, and the result was positive. But in the discharge notes, this crucial finding was buried under reassurances about stress-related symptoms and recommendations for anxiety management. I had been one blood test away from a lupus diagnosis at age 20. Instead, my mother's narrative about stress and sensitivity had convinced the emergency room team to treat my positive ANA as insignificant, and I had suffered for 8 more years without proper treatment. The most devastating document was a consultation note from 2018, when I had briefly seen a rheumatologist after my workplace collapse. Dr. Kumar had conducted a thorough examination and suspected lupus, ordering comprehensive blood work and recommending immediate treatment. But my mother had convinced me that he was looking for problems that didn't exist, and I had canceled my follow-up appointment, never seeing the test results that would have confirmed my diagnosis 6 years earlier. Reading through these records, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Vindication, certainly here, was objective proof that my symptoms had been real, documented and medically significant for decades, but also rage at the opportunities missed, the specialists dismissed, the test results ignored because they didn't fit my family's preferred narrative. The records also revealed something I hadn't fully understood: how many medical professionals had tried to help me over the years. Mrs. Patterson, Dr. Martinez, Dr. Harrison, Dr. Kumar, and others had all recognized that something serious was happening and had attempted to investigate or advocate for proper care. They had been overruled not by medical evidence, but by family politics and a mother who couldn't accept that her daughter's suffering was real. I created a timeline from the records, mapping my symptom progression against the missed opportunities. For diagnosis, the pattern was clear. Every few years, a medical professional would identify concerning symptoms and recommend further evaluation. And every time, my mother's influence would redirect the conversation toward stress management and psychological explanations. The most recent entries told a different story. After my ICU admission, when my condition was too severe to dismiss or minimize, the medical professionals had taken control of my care. Dr. Chun's notes showed a systematic dismantling of the stress and sensitivity narrative, replaced by objective evidence of serious autoimmune disease. Her final note in the series was particularly pointed. Patient's lupus diagnosis represents a clear case of medical delay caused by family dismissal of symptoms. The 20-year progression from initial symptoms to diagnosis has resulted in irreversible organ damage that could have been prevented with appropriate early intervention. This case highlights the importance of believing patients, particularly young women with complex symptom presentations. Sitting at my dining room table, surrounded by 347 pages of my medical history, I finally had the evidence I'd needed my entire life. Not just proof that my symptoms were real, but documentation of how systematically they had been dismissed, minimized, and ignored. The medical records didn't just validate my experience, they indicted the system of dismissal that had nearly cost me my life. But most importantly, they gave me something I'd never had before: an unassailable foundation for advocating for my own care. No one could ever again dismiss my symptoms as drama or attention-seeking, because the medical evidence was overwhelming and official. The little girl who had been told she was too sensitive, now had 347 pages of proof that she had been fighting a real disease with courage and determination for 20 years. The voice recording of our family meeting exists because I knew that without documentation, my mother would find a way to rewrite what happened. I sent my phone to record when I called them to my apartment that Sunday afternoon, telling them I had something important to discuss about my diagnosis. The 47-minute audio file captures everything: the presentations of evidence, the defensive reactions, the moment when denial finally cracked under the weight of medical truth. I had spent weeks preparing for this conversation, organizing the medical records chronologically, highlighting the most damning evidence, and practicing what I would say. This wasn't going to be an emotional confrontation. It was going to be a systematic presentation of facts that no one could dismiss or minimize. When my parents and Miranda arrived, they found my dining room transformed into a medical evidence room. The 347 pages of records were organized in neat stacks, with key documents copied and highlighted. I had created a timeline poster showing the progression of my symptoms alongside the missed opportunities for diagnosis. The visual impact was immediate and undeniable. "Ashly, what is all this?" my mother asked, her voice already carrying a defensive edge. "This is my complete medical history," I said, gesturing to the organized papers. "Every doctor's visit, every test result, every documented symptom from the past 20 years. I wanted you to see the full picture of what's been happening to me." I started with Mrs. Patterson's elementary school records, reading aloud her careful documentation of my symptoms and her repeated recommendations for medical evaluation. My father listened with growing attention, occasionally asking questions about specific dates or events. Miranda, true to her medical training, picked up some of the lab reports and began studying them with professional interest. But my mother sat rigidly in her chair, her face set in an expression of barely controlled irritation. "Ashly, I don't understand what you're trying to prove here. We all know you've had health issues that you consistently dismissed as attention-seeking behavior." I interrupted, pulling out Dr. Chun's notes about family history of medical gaslighting. "Health issues that multiple doctors wanted to investigate, but you convinced me were just stress and sensitivity." I walked them through the timeline, showing how each medical professional had identified concerning symptoms and recommended further evaluation. I read aloud the discharge notes from my college emergency room visit, highlighting the positive NA test that had been dismissed because of the family history of dramatic episodes. "This test," I said, holding up the lab report, "this test from when I was 20 years old showed that I had lupus. If anyone had followed up on it, I could have been diagnosed and treated 8 years ago. Instead, you convinced me that Dr. Martinez was looking for problems that didn't exist." Miranda was the first to break. As a pediatric nurse, she understood the implications of the medical evidence better than our parents. "Oh my God, Ashly," she whispered, staring at the lab results. "These numbers ... This is serious disease. How long have you been dealing with this alone?" 20 years, I said simply. 20 years of being told I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too weak to handle normal stress. 20 years of doctors trying to help me while my own family convinced me I was imagining things. I played the recording of my mother's conversation with the ICU staff, where she had dismissed my collapse as Ashly being dramatic again. The sound of her own voice, minimizing my medical emergency while I was unconscious in intensive care, seemed to shock her into silence. "Mom," I said, my voice steady despite the emotion building in my chest, "I need you to understand what your dismissal of my symptoms has cost me. Dr. Chun says the delay in diagnosis has caused irreversible organ damage. My kidneys are permanently affected. The neurological damage will never fully heal. I will be on immunosuppressive medications for The rest of my life, managing a disease that could have been controlled if it had been caught early. My father was staring at the timeline poster, his face pale with realization. Ashly, we didn't know. If we had understood, you didn't want to know, I said, my voice rising slightly. Every time a doctor expressed concern, you found a way to dismiss it. Every time I tried to tell you how sick I felt, you made it about my character instead of my health. You taught me to doubt my own experiences, to minimize my own suffering, to apologize for symptoms I couldn't control. I pulled out the most damning piece of evidence, the consultation note from Dr. Kumar in 2018, showing that he had suspected lupus and ordered confirmatory tests that I had never followed up on because my mother had convinced me he was looking for problems. This doctor, I said, holding up the report, this doctor could have diagnosed me 6 years ago. But you convinced me he was trying to create illness where none existed. You made me afraid to advocate for my own health because I'd been trained to believe that my symptoms were evidence of personal weakness. My mother's composure finally cracked. I was trying to help you, she said, her voice shaking. I was trying to teach you to be strong, to not let every little thing overwhelm you. I thought if you learned to push through, you thought wrong, I said firmly. You taught me to ignore serious medical symptoms. You taught me that my pain didn't matter, that my experiences weren't valid, that seeking help was evidence of failure. You nearly killed me with your good intentions. The room fell silent except for the sound of Miranda quietly crying as she read through more of the medical records. The evidence was overwhelming, the timeline undeniable, the cost of dismissal clearly documented in medical terminology that no one could argue with. I want you to understand, I continued, that this isn't about blame, though there's plenty of that to go around. This is about making sure that nothing like this ever happens again. I will never again allow anyone, including family, to dismiss my medical experiences or convince me that my symptoms are character flaws. I outline my new boundaries. No more input on my medical decisions unless requested, no more commentary on my symptoms or treatment, and no more attempts to minimize or reframe my experiences. I would be managing my lupus with a team of specialists who believed me, supported me, and treated my health as a serious medical matter rather than a personal failing. And most importantly, I said, looking directly at my mother, I need you to acknowledge what happened here. I need you to admit that you were wrong about my symptoms, that your dismissal was harmful, and that the delay in my diagnosis was partly due to your influence on my medical care. The silence stretched for several minutes. My father was studying the medical records, occasionally shaking his head in what looked like regret. Miranda was wiping her eyes, clearly processing the implications of years of family dysfunction around my health. And my mother sat frozen, staring at the evidence of her role in my medical neglect. Finally, she spoke, her voice small and strained. I was wrong about your symptoms. I thought I was helping you become stronger. I didn't understand that you were really sick. It wasn't a complete apology, and it didn't acknowledge the full scope of the harm caused by years of medical gaslighting. But it was the first time my mother had ever admitted that her approach to my health had been fundamentally wrong. The recorded conversation would become important. Documentation of my family's acknowledgement of their role in delaying my diagnosis. More importantly, it marked the beginning of a new dynamic where my medical experiences would be taken seriously, believed without question, and supported without reservation. The little girl who had been dismissed and minimized for decades had finally assembled enough evidence to demand that her truth be acknowledged. The voice recording captured not just a family conversation, but the moment when medical reality finally overcame years of denial and dismissal. My mother's handwritten apology letter arrived 3 weeks after our family confrontation, delivered not through the mail, but left on my doorstep like a confession she couldn't bear to hand over directly. The cream-colored stationery and careful, Cursive couldn't disguise what it really was, a forced acknowledgement of 20 years of medical neglect, written only after the evidence became too overwhelming to deny. Dear Ashly, it began. I have spent these past weeks thinking about our conversation and reviewing the medical records you shared. I realize now that I was wrong about your symptoms and that my approach to your health concerns caused you significant harm. The letter was 2 pages long, carefully worded like a legal document rather than a heartfelt apology. She acknowledged that she had minimized my symptoms, that she had discouraged medical evaluation, and that her actions had contributed to delays in proper diagnosis and treatment. But even in admission, she couldn't fully own the scope of what she had done. I thought I was helping you develop resilience and strength, she wrote. I believed that teaching you to push through discomfort would serve you well in life. I now understand that I was treating serious medical symptoms as character issues, and I deeply regret the consequences of my misunderstanding. The word misunderstanding particularly stung. What had happened to me wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a systematic dismissal of my medical reality that had lasted for decades. But I could see this was as close to a full acknowledgement as my mother was capable of making. Extended family's reaction to my diagnosis had been swift and telling. Word spread quickly through our network of aunts, uncles, and cousins, and their responses revealed how deeply my mother's narrative about my sensitivity had penetrated our family culture. Aunt Carol, who had previously suggested I needed tough love, called to apologize for her comments about my health. Honey, I had no idea you were dealing with lupus all these years. Your mother always made it sound like you just needed to learn better coping skills. Uncle Jim, my father's brother, was more direct in his criticism. Bob, he told my father during a tense family phone call that I overheard. How could you not know your daughter was seriously ill? How could you let Helen convince everyone that Ashly was just being dramatic? The family dynamics shifted dramatically as relatives began to re-examine years of interactions. Through the lens of my diagnosis, cousins reached out to apologize for not taking my health seriously. Family friends who had rolled their eyes at my frequent absences from gatherings now sent cards, expressing regret for their lack of understanding. But the most significant change was in Miranda's relationship with me. As a medical professional, she understood better than anyone what the delayed diagnosis meant for my long-term health. She called me several times a week, asking about my treatment, researching lupus management strategies, and expressing guilt about her role in the family dynamic. I should have known, she said during one particularly emotional conversation. I'm a nurse. I should have recognized that your symptoms were serious and advocated for proper evaluation. Instead, I just went along with Mom's narrative because it was easier. You were caught in the same system I was, I told her. Mom had convinced everyone that questioning her assessment of my health was somehow enabling my weakness. Even medical professionals got sucked into that narrative. The workplace reaction was equally revealing. Janet, my supervisor, called when she heard about my diagnosis to express her support and apologize for any time she had been frustrated with my absences. Ashly, I had no idea you were dealing with such a serious condition. I wish you had felt comfortable sharing this information earlier, but I explained that I hadn't known myself until recently. I was told for so long that my symptoms were stress-related that I believed it too. I was as frustrated with my absences as you were, because I couldn't understand why I couldn't handle normal work demands like everyone else. HR arranged for accommodations under the Americans with Disabilities Act flexible scheduling for medical appointments, work from home options during flares, and adjusted expectations during treatment periods. For the first time in my career, my health needs were being treated as legitimate medical requirements rather than personal failings. The most difficult conversations were with the friends I'd lost over the years due to my unreliable health. Many had drifted away after repeatedly canceled plans, missed events, and what they perceived as my inability to commit to normal social activities. Now, with my diagnosis public knowledge, some reached out to apologize and attempt to rebuild connections. Sarah, my college roommate who had called 911 during my sophomore year collapse, sent a long email expressing regret about not pushing harder for medical answers at the time. I knew something serious was wrong, she wrote, but I was young and didn't know how to advocate against your family's insistence that you were just stressed. Others were less gracious. Some friends seemed almost resentful that my health issues had been legitimate, as if my diagnosis somehow made their previous frustrations inappropriate. A few made comments suggesting that I should have tried harder to get proper medical care, not understanding how effectively my family had trained me to doubt my own experiences, but the most profound change was in my relationship with medical professionals. Armed with a clear diagnosis and a documented history of symptom dismissal, I approached healthcare with a new confidence. I no longer apologized for my symptoms or downplayed their severity. I came to appointments with detailed records, specific questions, and clear expectations for thorough evaluation and treatment. Dr. Chen became not just my rheumatologist, but an advocate who understood the psychological impact of years of medical gaslighting. She referred me to a therapist who specialized in chronic illness and medical trauma, helping me process the complex emotions around finally being believed. What you experienced, the therapist, Dr. Williams, explained during one of our early sessions, is a form of medical gaslighting that's unfortunately common among young women with autoimmune conditions. Your reality was systematically denied by people who should have been protecting and advocating for you. The therapy helped me understand that my struggle to advocate for myself wasn't a personal failing. It was the result of decades of training to doubt my own experiences. I had to learn to trust my body again, to believe that my symptoms were valid, and to demand appropriate medical care without apologizing for needing it. The legal implications of my delayed diagnosis were complex. Dr. Chen suggested that I might have grounds for a medical malpractice case, particularly regarding the positive NA test that had been ignored during my college emergency room visit. But pursuing legal action would require reliving years of medical neglect and potentially damaging my relationships with family members, who would likely be called as witnesses. Instead, I chose to focus on ensuring that my story could help other young women who might be experiencing similar dismissal of their symptoms. I shared my experience with lupus advocacy organizations, wrote about medical gaslighting for chronic illness blogs, and spoke at medical conferences about the importance of believing patients, particularly young women with complex symptom presentations. The financial implications were significant. Years of delayed diagnosis meant that my lupus had progressed to the point where I needed expensive specialty medications, frequent monitoring, and ongoing care from multiple specialists. The immunosuppressive drugs alone cost thousands of dollars per month, and I would need regular blood work, imaging studies, and specialist consultations for the rest of my life. My mother's offer to help with medical expenses felt complicated. Part of me wanted to refuse any assistance from someone who had contributed to the delay in my diagnosis, but the practical reality was that lupus treatment was expensive, and I needed all the support I could get to manage the financial burden of chronic illness. "I know this doesn't make up for what happened," she said during one awkward conversation about insurance and medication costs, "but I want to help however I can." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a step toward a new relationship based on acknowledging reality rather than denying it. My mother's handwritten apology letter became a turning point, not because it erased 20 years of harm, but because it represented her first genuine attempt to take responsibility for her role in my medical neglect. The letter now sits in a folder with all my other important medical documents, a reminder of how far we'd come and how much damage could be done by refusing to believe someone's experience of their own body. It's also a promise to myself that I will never again allow anyone to convince me that my symptoms are anything other than what they are: real, valid, and deserving of proper medical attention. The reckoning wasn't just about my family acknowledging their mistakes. It was about me reclaiming my right to be believed, to be taken seriously, and to advocate for my own health without apologizing for needing care. The little girl who had been told she was too sensitive had finally assembled enough evidence to demand that her truth be acknowledged, and more importantly, had learned to trust that truth herself. The thank you cards from my coworkers arrived in a steady stream over the weeks following my diagnosis announcement, each one a small revelation about who had really been paying attention to my struggles all along. The cards revealed something I hadn't expected: that many people in my life had recognized my symptoms as serious medical issues, even when my family couldn't. "Ashly," wrote Tom from the creative department, "I always knew you were dealing with something real. The way you pushed through those migraines during client presentations was incredible. I'm glad you finally have answers and proper treatment." Janet's card was particularly meaningful. "Your dedication to work despite serious health challenges has been inspiring. I regret any times I expressed frustration with your absences. I should have advocated more strongly for you to get the medical care you needed." These expressions of support revealed a truth I was only beginning to understand. My real support system hadn't been my family, who dismissed my experiences, but the colleagues, friends, and acquaintances who had believed me when I said I wasn't feeling well, who had covered for me during difficult periods, and who had never made me feel guilty for having health issues. Sarah from accounting included a note with her card that brought me to tears. "I never understood why you apologized so much for being sick. Everyone could see you were struggling, and everyone respected how hard you worked despite obvious health problems. You never needed to prove anything to us." The contrast between these workplace responses and my family's decades of dismissal was stark. My coworkers had known me for less than 3 years, but they had recognized and respected my health challenges in ways my family never had. They had seen my symptoms as medical issues that required accommodation, not character flaws that required correction. Building new relationships with proper boundaries around my health felt revolutionary. For the first time in my life, I was able to tell people honestly about my lupus without apologizing for having a chronic illness. I could explain why I might need to cancel plans or leave events early, and instead of judgment, I received understanding and support. Dating with lupus meant learning to have conversations I'd never been equipped for. When I met David through a chronic illness support group, I was able to be honest about my health from the beginning. He understood the unpredictability of symptoms, the complexity of treatment, and the importance of having partners who believed and supported rather than minimized and dismissed. "You don't have to prove that you're sick enough," he told me during one of our early conversations. "You don't have to justify your symptoms or apologize for needing medical care. Your health is what it is, and anyone worth being in your life will accept that reality." This was revolutionary thinking for someone who had spent decades trying to prove that her symptoms were real. David's matter-of-fact acceptance of my lupus helped me understand what healthy support actually looked like. He never questioned my symptoms, never suggested that I was being dramatic, and never made me feel guilty for the limitations that chronic illness imposed on our relationship. The friendship with Miranda evolved slowly and carefully. As a medical professional, she understood the seriousness of my diagnosis better than anyone in my family, but she also carried guilt about her years of going along with my mother's dismissive narrative. "I keep thinking about all the times you tried to tell us how sick you felt," she said during one of our weekly phone calls. "I keep thinking about how I could have used my medical knowledge to advocate for you instead of just accepting Mom's explanations. But I wasn't interested in dwelling on the past." Miranda's guilt, while understandable, couldn't change what had happened. What mattered now was building a relationship based on the current reality that I had lupus, that I needed ongoing medical care, and that I expected my family to support rather than question my health management. Miranda threw herself into lupus research with the intensity she brought to everything. She sent me articles about new treatments, connected me with other nurses who had experience with autoimmune patients, and became my strongest advocate within the family for proper medical support. The relationship with my father improved more easily than I had expected. He seemed genuinely horrified to learn about the extent of my health issues and his role in dismissing them. Unlike my mother, who was defensive and focused on managing her own guilt, my father simply wanted to understand and help. "I should have questioned your mother's approach," he admitted during one of our conversations. "I should have insisted on medical evaluation when you were clearly struggling. I failed you as a father, and I want to do better now." His support became practical and consistent. He drove me to medical appointments when I was too fatigued to drive myself, helped research specialists and treatment options, and became an unexpected advocate for aggressive medical management of my condition. The most challenging relationship to rebuild was with my mother. Her handwritten apology had been a start, but decades of dismissal couldn't be undone with a single letter. Trust had to be rebuilt slowly, through consistent actions rather than words. My mother struggled with the new boundaries I had established around my health. She seemed to want credit for accepting my diagnosis, as if acknowledging medical reality was something that deserved praise rather than being a basic requirement for maintaining our relationship. "I'm trying, Ashly," she said during one tense conversation. "I'm trying to be supportive of your health needs." "Trying isn't enough," I replied firmly. "I need you to actually be supportive. That means no more commentary on my symptoms, no more suggestions that I'm being too careful with my health, and no more attempts to minimize the seriousness of my condition." The process was gradual and sometimes frustrating. My mother would slip back into old patterns, questioning whether I really needed to rest during a flare, suggesting that I was being overcautious about medication compliance, or making comments about how well I looked on good days. Each time I had to reinforce the boundaries. "Mom, that's exactly the kind of comment that contributed to my delayed diagnosis. My health management is not up for discussion or critique." Slowly, she began to understand that her decades of medical authority in my life were over. I was Anne, adult with a serious chronic illness, supported by a team of medical professionals who believed me and treated my health as a priority. Her role now was to support that medical care, not to question or direct it. The thank you cards from my coworkers became symbols of what healthy support looked like: acknowledgement without judgment, accommodation without resentment, and respect for my health needs without requiring proof of their legitimacy. These cards reminded me that not everyone in my life had dismissed my struggles, and that I deserved relationships built on belief rather than doubt. Building new relationships and rebuilding old ones with proper boundaries around my health felt like learning to live in a different world. For the first time, I was surrounded by people who accepted my lupus as a medical reality rather than a character flaw, who supported my health management rather than questioning it, and who believed my experiences without requiring extensive documentation or proof. The little girl who had learned to doubt her own symptoms was finally learning to trust them, and more importantly, learning to trust the people who believed and supported her unconditionally. The treatment plan document from Dr. Chun sits on my refrigerator like a roadmap to a life I never thought possible, a life where my symptoms are managed rather than dismissed, where my health needs are accommodated rather than criticized, and where I can plan for the future with realistic expectations about living well with lupus. Patient responding well to methotrexate and hydroxychloroquine combination therapy. Dr. Chun's latest notes read: inflammatory markers improved significantly over past 6 months. Kidney function stable. Recommend continuing current regimen with quarterly monitoring. For the first time in my adult life, my medical records contained words like improved, stable, and responding well. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete. Lupus doesn't disappear with treatment, it becomes manageable. The migraines still come, but they're less frequent and less severe. The fatigue is still a daily reality, but it's no longer overwhelming. The joint pain flares during weather changes and stress, but I have medications that help and strategies for managing bad days. Most importantly, I have a medical team that believes me when I report symptoms and adjusts treatment accordingly. When I tell Dr. Chun that my fatigue is worsening, she orders blood work to check my inflammatory markers rather than suggesting stress management techniques. When I report new joint pain, she examines the affected areas and considers medication adjustments rather than dismissing the complaint as attention-seeking. The workplace accommodations made an enormous difference in my ability to maintain a career while managing chronic illness. The flexible schedule allowed me to work from home during flares, schedule medical appointments without using vacation time, and adjust my hours based on my daily energy levels. Janet and I developed a communication system where I could honestly report how I was feeling without apologizing for having health needs. Ashly, you're one of our most creative and dedicated employees, Janet told me during my annual review. The accommodations we've made aren't charity. They're good business practices that allow talented people to contribute despite health challenges. This perspective was revolutionary for someone who had spent years feeling guilty about her health's impact on her work performance. I was learning that accommodation wasn't about lowering standards. It was about creating conditions where I could meet those standards despite having lupus. The financial reality of chronic illness took time to navigate. Even with insurance, the monthly costs of medications, regular lab work, and specialist appointments added up to thousands of dollars per year. I had to learn to budget for medical expenses the way other people budgeted for car payments or vacation. Funds. My mother's offer to help with medical costs came with complicated emotions. Part of me resented needing financial assistance from someone who had contributed to delaying my diagnosis. But the practical reality was that lupus treatment was expensive, and I needed all the support I could get. This isn't about forgiveness, I told her during one of our conversations about medical expenses. This is about practical support for managing a chronic illness. If you want to help, this is one way to do it. She set up an automatic transfer to help cover my medication costs. And while it didn't erase 20 years of dismissal, it represented a concrete acknowledgement of her role in my health struggles and a commitment to supporting my current treatment. The relationship with my family settled into a new normal based on clear boundaries and realistic expectations. My mother no longer offered opinions about my symptoms or treatment decisions, but she asked thoughtful questions about how my health was affecting my life and what kind of support I needed. Miranda became my unofficial medical advocate within the family, using her nursing knowledge to help relatives understand the seriousness of lupus and the importance of supporting my health management decisions. She also became a resource for research about new treatments and strategies for managing autoimmune conditions. My father's support was steady and practical. He drove me to medical appointments when I was too fatigued, helped with household tasks during flares, and never questioned my need for rest or medication compliance. His matter-of-fact acceptance of my health needs became model for how I wanted all my relationships to function. Dating David had taught me what healthy romantic relationships looked like when chronic illness was involved. We developed routines around my lupus, scheduling low-key dates when I was flaring, planning vacations with built-in rest time, and communicating openly about how my health was affecting our relationship. Your lupus is part of who you are, he said during one conversation about our future together. I'm not dating you despite your chronic illness. I'm dating all of you, including the parts that involve managing lupus. This acceptance allowed me to be honest about my limitations without feeling guilty about them. I could say, I'm too tired for dinner out tonight without apologizing or feeling like I was disappointing him. I could take afternoon naps without explaining or justifying my need for rest. The support groups for young women with autoimmune conditions became an unexpected source of community and validation. Hearing other women's stories about delayed diagnosis, family dismissal, and the challenge of advocating for proper medical care made me realize how common my experience had been. The medical system is particularly bad at believing young women, explained Lisa, a woman with rheumatoid arthritis who had been misdiagnosed for 15 years. We're taught to minimize our symptoms, to apologize for needing care, and to accept dismissive treatment from doctors and family members. These groups taught me advocacy strategies, helped me understand my rights as a patient, and provided emotional support from people who truly understood the complexity of living with invisible chronic illness. For the first time, I was surrounded by people who never questioned whether my symptoms were real or whether I was managing my health appropriately. The annual lupus walk became a family event. My parents, Miranda and David, all participated, wearing purple shirts and carrying signs about lupus awareness. Seeing my family publicly supporting lupus research and advocacy felt symbolic of how far our relationships had come. I'm proud of how you've handled your diagnosis, my mother said as we walked together. I'm proud of how you've learned to advocate for yourself and build a support system around your health needs. It wasn't a complete apology for 20 years of dismissal, but it was an acknowledgement of my strength and resilience. More importantly, it was recognition that managing lupus required skills and courage that deserved respect rather than criticism. The treatment plan on my refrigerator represents more than just medical management. It represents a life where my health is taken seriously, where my symptoms are believed and addressed, and where I can build a future around realistic expectations rather than constant struggle against dismissal and doubt. Living well with lupus means accepting that some days will be harder than others, that treatment is ongoing rather than curative, and that managing chronic illness requires both medical support and personal advocacy. But it also means understanding that I deserve to be believed, supported, and accommodated in my pursuit of the fullest life possible within the constraints of my condition. The new normal isn't perfect, but it's honest. My family now understands that I have a serious chronic illness that requires ongoing management. My workplace accommodates my health needs without making me feel guilty. My romantic relationship is built on acceptance rather than denial of my health realities. Most importantly, I've learned to trust my own experiences, to advocate for appropriate medical care, and to build relationships with people who believe and support me rather than minimize and dismiss my health needs. The little girl who was told she was too sensitive has become a woman who knows that sensitivity to her own body's signals is actually a strength that helps her manage a complex chronic illness effectively. The journal entry I wrote on the 1-year anniversary of my diagnosis captures a transformation I never thought possible. Today marks 1 year since Dr. Chun told me I had lupus. 1 year since my family's narrative about my sensitivity finally crumbled under the weight of medical evidence. 1 year since I learned to trust my own experiences and demand the care I deserved. This year has been about more than managing a chronic illness. It's been about reclaiming my right to be believed. Sitting in my apartment on that anniversary morning, I reflected on how profoundly my life had changed. Not just because of the lupus diagnosis itself, but because of everything that diagnosis had forced into the light decades of family dysfunction, medical gaslighting, and my own learned helplessness when it came to advocating for my health. The physical improvements were significant. The combination of methotrexate and hydroxychloroquine had reduced my inflammatory markers to nearly normal levels. The crushing fatigue that had defined my days was manageable with proper medication and rest. The migraines still came, but they were less frequent and responded better to treatment now that they were understood as neurological manifestations of lupus rather than stress-related headaches. But the emotional and psychological changes were even more profound. For the first time in my adult life, I approached medical appointments with confidence rather than apology. I reported symptoms honestly without downplaying their severity. I asked questions about treatment options and expected thorough answers. I have learned to be a partner in my healthcare rather than a passive recipient of dismissive reassurances. The family dynamics had settled into something that resembled healthy function, though it required constant maintenance of boundaries. My mother still occasionally slipped into old patterns of questioning my symptoms or suggesting that I was being overcautious about my health management. But now I had the confidence and support system to shut down those conversations immediately. "Mom, we've discussed this," I would say firmly. "My health management is not up for discussion or critique. If you can't be supportive, we can talk about something else." The change in her response was telling. Instead of becoming defensive or escalating the argument, she would back down and apologize. The medical evidence of my lupus had created a foundation that even she couldn't argue with, and my clear boundaries had established consequences for dismissive behavior. Miranda's relationship with me had evolved into genuine sisterhood for the first time. Her medical knowledge made her a valuable advocate, but more importantly, her guilt about years of going along with family dismissal had motivated her to become the kind of support I'd always needed. I think about that little girl in elementary school complaining about headaches, she said during one of our conversations, and I realized that kid was showing incredible strength. You were advocating for yourself when no one else would advocate for you. This reframing of my childhood experiences was healing in ways I hadn't expected. Instead of seeing myself as the dramatic, attention-seeking child my family had described, I was learning to see a young girl who had courageously insisted that her pain was real despite everyone around her saying otherwise. The workplace had become a model for how chronic illness could be accommodated without compromising professional standards. My productivity actually improved once I stopped pushing through severe symptoms and started working with my body's limitations rather than against them. The flexible schedule allowed me to work during my peak energy hours and rest when my body demanded it. Janet and I had developed a communication system that felt revolutionary in its simplicity. "How are you feeling today?" she would ask during our weekly check-ins, and I could answer honestly, "I'm flaring, so I'll work from home and might need to sign off early," without apologizing or providing extensive justification. This normalization of health needs as practical considerations rather than personal failings had ripple effects throughout my life. I could cancel social plans due to lupus symptoms without elaborate explanations or guilt. I could prioritize rest and medical care without feeling selfish. I could advocate for my needs in all areas of my life because I had finally learned that those needs were legitimate and worthy of accommodation. The relationship with David had become a blueprint for what love could look like when chronic illness was involved. He never made me feel guilty for having lupus, never suggested that I wasn't managing my health properly, and never treated my symptoms as inconveniences to our relationship. "Your strength in dealing with lupus is one of the things I admire most about you," he told me on our anniversary. "Watching you advocate for yourself, build a support system, and create a life that works with your health needs has been inspiring." This perspective helped me understand that my lupus journey hadn't been about weakness or failure. It had been about resilience and determination. The little girl who had insisted her symptoms were real despite years of dismissal had grown into a woman who could advocate effectively for complex medical needs. The legal consultation about my delayed diagnosis had ultimately led nowhere. The statute of limitations had passed for most of the medical malpractice that might have occurred, and proving causation between family dismissal and delayed diagnosis would have been complex and expensive. But I found other ways to ensure that my experience could help prevent similar situations for other young women. I spoke at medical conferences about the importance of believing patients, particularly women with complex symptom presentations. I wrote articles for chronic illness advocacy organizations about medical gaslighting and family dismissal of symptoms. The feedback from these efforts was overwhelming. Women contacted me to share their own stories of dismissal, delayed diagnosis, and the challenge of advocating for proper medical care in families that didn't believe their symptoms were real. "Your story helped me understand that I wasn't crazy," one woman wrote. "I've been told for years that my fatigue and joint pain were stress-related, but your experience gave me the courage to seek a second opinion. I was just diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis." These connections reminded me that my experience, painful as it had been, could serve a purpose beyond my own healing. Every young woman who read my story and decided to advocate more strongly for her health, every family that learned to take chronic illness seriously, every medical professional who committed to believing patients, all of these represented victories that emerged from years of struggle. The financial impact of lupus had stabilized into a manageable routine. The monthly medication costs, quarterly lab work, and regular specialist appointments were expensive, but I had learned to budget for them and access all available resources for support. My mother's contribution to medical expenses had become a practical arrangement rather than an emotional battleground. Most importantly, I had learned to see my lupus not as a personal failing or evidence of weakness, but as a medical condition that required ongoing management. The shame that had surrounded my symptoms for decades had been replaced by matter-of-fact acceptance and strategic planning. The journal entry ended with a reflection that captured the essence of my transformation. I spent 20 years learning to doubt my own experiences, to minimize my own suffering, and to apologize for having health needs. This year has been about unlearning all of that damage and rebuilding my relationship with my own body based on trust, advocacy, and appropriate medical care. The little girl who had been dismissed as too sensitive had become a woman who understood that sensitivity to her body's signals was actually a strength. The teenager who had been labeled as dramatic had learned that drama wasn't the problem was adults who couldn't handle the reality of chronic illness in young people. The young woman who had been told she was seeking attention had discovered that seeking appropriate medical attention was exactly what she should have been doing all along. The attention she had needed wasn't emotional validation. It was proper diagnosis and treatment of a serious autoimmune condition. 1 year after my diagnosis, I could finally say that I was living well with lupus. Not because the disease was gone, but because I had built a life that accommodated its realities while refusing to be defined by its limitations. I had surrounded myself with people who believed me, supported me, and respected my health needs without question. The medical records that had once seemed like evidence of my weakness now felt like documentation of my strength. Every doctor's visit, every symptom complaint, every request for a medical evaluation had been an act of self-advocacy that eventually led to proper diagnosis and treatment. The family that had once dismissed my experiences had learned to support them. The workplace that had once seen my health needs as problems had learned to see them as conditions requiring accommodation. The medical system that had once failed me had finally provided the comprehensive care I deserved. But most importantly, I have learned to trust myself to believe my own experiences, to advocate for my own needs, and to demand the care and respect I deserved. The journey from dismissal to validation had been long and painful, but it had taught me that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is insist that your truth be acknowledged, even when everyone around you refuses to see it. The medical records, that shut my mother up had done more than just prove my symptoms were real. They had given me permission to trust my own voice, to advocate for my own health, and to build a life where being believed was the foundation rather than the exception. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family's story, if you've ever been told your pain isn't real, if you've ever been made to feel guilty for having health needs, know that your experiences matter. Your symptoms deserve investigation, and you have the right to demand proper medical care without apology. Sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to be silent about your own truth.